Some people leave behind buildings. Others leave behind books. A few leave behind ideas that continue to shape the world long after they are gone. But every now and then, someone leaves behind a voice that refuses to fade. For decades, that voice echoed through the streets of Lagos. It challenged presidents. It angered soldiers. It inspired musicians. It gave ordinary people words for frustrations they had carried in silence. Some called him a genius. Others called him a troublemaker. The government arrested him again and again. His home was destroyed. His mother died after a military raid that shocked the nation. Still, the music never stopped. But this is not the story of a legend. It is the story of a boy. A boy born into a home where music was as common as morning prayers. Where courage was not taught in speeches, but lived every day. And where the lessons of one family would one day echo far beyond the walls of their house. Because history does not begin with fame. It begins with ordinary people living ordinary lives. Unaware that the choices they make will one day become part of the world's memory. This is the story of how one young boy from Abeokuta became one of Africa's most influential musicians. And one of its most fearless voices. This is the life of Fela Anikulapo Kuti. Chapter 1, A House Full of Voices. Morning came gently to Abeokuta. The first sounds were often birds calling from the trees. Then came footsteps in the yard. Doors opened. Water was carried from one place to another. Before long, voices filled the house. Some spoke softly. Others laughed. Somewhere nearby, a hymn rose into the morning air. Long before crowds would gather to hear his music. This was the world that surrounded a young boy. He was born on October 15, 1938, in Abeokuta. In what was then British-ruled Nigeria. His parents named him Olufula Olusegun Oluditon Ransom Kuti. Years later, the world would know him simply as Fela. But in those early days, he was just another child learning from the people around him. His home was unlike many others. His father, the Reverend Israel Oluditon Ransom Kuti, was an Anglican minister, teacher, and school principal. Discipline was part of everyday life. Education was expected. Music was not only something to enjoy. It was part of worship, family, and routine. His mother, Funmileo Ransom Kuti, lived a very different kind of public life. She was one of Nigeria's leading women's rights activists. She organized women, challenged unfair taxes, and spoke openly against injustice during a time when few people dared to question those in power. Their home stood at the meeting point of faith, education, music, and public service. For a child growing up inside those walls, the world was already much bigger than the street outside. Visitors often came to the house. Clergy, community leaders, activists. Conversations moved from family matters to questions about schools, communities, and the future of the country. A young boy could not have understood every discussion. But he did not need to. He was growing up in a place where ideas mattered. Outside the family home, life in Abeokuta followed its own rhythm. The markets filled early each morning. Traders arranged baskets of food beneath colorful umbrellas. Tailors worked patiently beside their sewing machines. Children hurried to school. Bicycle bells rang through narrow streets. The smell of cooked food drifted through busy neighborhoods. Life moved forward one ordinary day at a time. Yet another presence shaped nearly every part of that life. Nigeria was still under British colonial rule. Many of the country's political decisions were made far away by officials who had never called these streets home. British influence reached into schools, churches, courts, and government offices. For many Nigerians, colonial rule was not an event. It was simply the system they had been born into. The young boy growing up in Abeokuta did not choose that world. It was simply the world he knew. Music, however, offered something different. Church services introduced him to hymns and choir singing. Western classical music could be heard alongside Nigerian musical traditions. Brass instruments, drums, voices. and rhythm all became familiar long before anyone imagined they could one day be combined into something entirely new. Music was never treated as background noise. It demanded attention. As he grew older, that attention became curiosity. Family members noticed his interest in music. He learned to listen carefully. He explored melodies. He became familiar with the piano, an instrument that would remain part of his musical life for years. But music was only one teacher. Watching his mother may have been another. Across Nigeria, Funmile Ransom Kuti became known for organizing thousands of women through the Abeokuta Women's Union. They protested unfair taxation and demanded greater respect from local authorities. Her campaigns showed that ordinary people could stand together and challenge powerful institutions. These events unfolded in public. Newspapers reported them. Crowds witnessed them. Meetings filled with determined voices became part of the city's memory. For the young boy at home, these were not distant stories from history books. They were happening around him. His father offered another example. He believed deeply in education, discipline, and responsibility. His work as a teacher and minister reflected those values every day. Different as they were, both parents believed that silence was not always the answer when something was wrong. Their methods were different. Their commitment was not. As the years passed, Nigeria itself was changing. Calls for independence grew louder across the country. Political parties expanded. Newspapers carried reports of constitutional meetings and debates about self-government. Across Africa, other colonies were also beginning to demand freedom from European rule. History was moving. Most families continued with daily life while those larger changes unfolded around them. So did the Ransom Kuti family. School remained important. Church remained important. Music remained important. The future, however, had begun to open in unexpected ways. By his late teenage years, the young man from Abeokuta had developed a growing love for music. His family hoped he would study medicine, a profession that promised stability and respect. It was a path many parents would have welcomed. The plan seemed clear. He would travel to Britain for his education. Leaving home meant more than crossing the sea. It meant leaving familiar voices behind. The streets of Abeokuta, family meals, church choirs, friends. The routines that had shaped his childhood would soon become memories carried across continents. In 1958, he left Nigeria for London. His parents believed he was going to study medicine. Instead, he enrolled at Trinity College of Music. The decision would change the course of his own life. It would also change the story of African music. But none of that was visible on the day he left home. There was no crowd waiting at the harbor. No newspaper announcing the beginning of a legend. Only a young man carrying the lessons of his family into a world he had never seen before. The music was waiting. So was history. Chapter 2, Finding Another Voice. London did not sound like Abeokuta. The streets were louder. Buses rolled past rows of brick buildings. Train stations filled with people rushing from one place to another. The air was colder. The pace was faster. For a young man arriving from Nigeria in 1958, almost everything felt unfamiliar. He had crossed continents, but he had also crossed into a different stage of his life. His family believed he had traveled to Britain to study medicine. Instead, he enrolled at Trinity College of Music. There, he devoted himself to learning music more deeply. He studied theory, composition, and performance while listening to sounds from many parts of the world. London exposed him to more than the classroom. The city was home to musicians from across Africa and the Caribbean. Jazz clubs stayed open late into the night. Highlife records from West Africa found their way into dance halls. American jazz, rhythm and blues, and Caribbean music mixed freely with British popular music. For a young musician, every performance became another lesson. Music was changing. So was he. Outside the concert halls, the world was changing too. Across Africa, One colony after another was moving toward independence. Ghana had already become independent in 1957. Nigeria's own independence was approaching. Newspapers carried stories of political change, new governments, and hopes for a different future. Many African students living in Britain followed these events closely. They discussed politics, identity, and the future of their countries. Some dreamed of returning home to build new nations. Others questioned whether political independence alone would solve deeper problems. The conversations were growing louder. In London, Fela met another Nigerian music student, Remilikan Remi Taylor. They later married, and together they began building a family while he continued pursuing music. Their first children were born during these years, as he balanced family responsibilities with rehearsals, performances, and his studies. Life demanded practical choices. Money was often limited. Success did not arrive overnight. After completing his studies, he formed a band that became known as Kula Lobitos. The group blended high life with jazz influences, creating music that reflected both West African traditions and the sounds he had encountered abroad. The band performed wherever opportunities appeared. Some nights the audiences were small. Some nights the halls were full. Every performance sharpened the musicians' skills. When Fela returned to Nigeria in the early 1960s, the country itself had entered a new chapter. Nigeria had gained independence from Britain in 1960. The celebrations had raised great hopes for the future. Many believed independence would bring prosperity, fairness, and national unity. But the years that followed proved more difficult. Political rivalry deepened. Military influence grew. Regional tensions increased. The optimism of independence slowly gave way to uncertainty. Back in Lagos, Kula Lobitos continued performing. The music was lively. It attracted audiences who wanted to dance after long days of work. Fela was becoming known as a talented bandleader, composer, and performer. Yet something seemed unfinished. His music entertained people. He had not yet found the sound that fully belonged to him. Then, in 1969, another journey changed everything. Kula Lobitos traveled to the United States for a tour. The trip did not bring the commercial success the band had hoped for. Instead, it brought something far more lasting. During his stay, Fela met Sandra Smith, later known as Sandra Isidore, a singer and political activist connected to the Black Power movement. She introduced him to books and ideas that examined colonialism, race, African history, and the struggle for liberation. Years later, Fela spoke openly about this period. He said Sandra helped open his eyes to political ideas he had not fully understood before. The meeting became one of the most important turning points in his life. He began reading the works of Black thinkers and activists. He explored ideas about African identity, self-determination, and the lasting effects of colonial rule. These were not entirely new questions, but they now carried a new urgency. The music also began to change. Jazz remained. High life remained. But the rhythms grew deeper. The songs became longer. The horns became bolder. Traditional Yoruba influences blended with funk, jazz, and powerful percussion into a sound unlike anything audiences had heard before. That sound would later become known around the world as Afrobeat. It was more than a new style of music. It was a new way of speaking. Fela also changed the way he used language. Rather than singing mainly in English, he increasingly embraced Nigerian pidgin. It allowed people from different ethnic backgrounds to understand his message. Workers, traders, students, and taxi drivers could all hear themselves in the words. The audience grew larger. So did the message. Music was no longer only about melody. It had become a conversation with society. When Fela returned to Nigeria, he brought home more than new songs. He brought new questions. Why had independence failed to deliver justice for so many? Why did corruption continue? Why were ordinary people still struggling while those in power lived differently? These questions began to appear in his music. At first, they arrived quietly. Then they became impossible to ignore. Audiences noticed the difference. The performances carried more energy. The lyrics became sharper. The stage became a place where music, politics, and everyday life met in front of thousands of people. Some listeners felt inspired. Others felt uncomfortable. Those in government also began to listen more carefully. A musician who once seemed interested only in entertaining crowds was becoming something else. His songs were no longer asking people only to dance. They were asking them to look around. And once those questions entered the music, they could not easily be taken back. The stage had become more than a stage. It was becoming a platform. Before long, that platform would grow into a place where music openly challenged power. And where power would eventually answer back. Chapter 3: Music Against Power. Night fell differently at the Africa Shrine. As the sun disappeared over Lagos, people began arriving from every direction. Workers came after long days on the job. Students squeezed into crowded buses. Traders closed their stalls. Musicians carried instruments through the doors. By the time the band was ready, the room was alive with expectation. No two nights were exactly the same. The music did not rush. A steady rhythm settled over the room. The drums found their place. The bass answered. Horns rose above the crowd. Then Fela stepped forward. People had come to dance. Many stayed to listen. By the early 1970s, Afrobeat had become something few had heard before. It blended highlife, jazz, funk, Yoruba rhythms, and long instrumental passages into a sound that demanded patience. Songs often stretched far beyond the length of a typical radio hit. They gave musicians room to improvise and gave listeners time to absorb the message. The message itself was changing. Fela no longer sang only about everyday life. His songs began to question corruption, abuse of power, and the widening gap between ordinary Nigerians and those who governed them. He sang in Nigerian pidgin so people from different backgrounds could understand without needing translation. His audience grew beyond the concert hall. Taxi drivers repeated his lyrics. Students debated them. Market traders discussed them. His music had entered everyday conversation. Nigeria was changing quickly. The country's oil industry brought enormous wealth during the 1970s. New buildings rose across Lagos. Businesses expanded. Foreign companies invested. On the surface, the country appeared to be moving toward prosperity. Yet many Nigerians saw a different reality. The wealth was not shared equally. Basic services remained unreliable in many places. Corruption became a growing public concern. Military governments continued to shape national life. And criticism of those in power carried real risks. These were the conditions in which Fela wrote. He did not speak as a politician. He spoke as a musician using the stage as his platform. His performances became part concert, part public discussion. Sometimes they lasted for hours. The audience laughed. They danced. They sang along. But they also listened. As his influence grew, Fela created a community that reflected his belief in living outside the control of the Nigerian state. He called it Abeokuta Republic. It served as his home, recording space, office, and gathering place for musicians, dancers, friends, family members, and supporters. Fela declared it independent in a symbolic act of resistance. The Nigerian government did not recognize that claim, but the name itself carried a message. Abeokuta was meant to represent freedom on its own terms. Life there followed its own rhythm. Musicians rehearsed during the day. Visitors arrived from Nigeria and abroad. Journalists came seeking interviews. Artists exchanged ideas. New songs were written. The compound became one of the most talked about places in Lagos. Not everyone admired it. Its unconventional way of life attracted criticism from religious leaders, politicians, and sections of the public. Newspapers often described Fela as controversial. His appearance, his lifestyle, and his refusal to follow social expectations made him a frequent subject of debate. Fela rarely softened his public image to satisfy his critics. Instead, he became even more outspoken. In interviews, he accused those in authority of betraying the people they were meant to serve. On stage, he challenged military rule through music and satire. His criticism reached audiences that newspapers sometimes could not. The authorities noticed. Police officers began visiting performances more often. Security agents watched his activities. His home was searched repeatedly. Arrests became increasingly common. Some charges were later dismissed by the courts. Others led to brief periods of detention. Each encounter with the authorities deepened the conflict between the musician and the state. The pattern became familiar. A performance. A confrontation. An arrest. Another performance. Yet each time he returned to the stage, the crowd seemed larger. People wanted to see the man everyone was talking about. Some came because they agreed with him. Others came because they were curious. Many simply wanted to witness what might happen next. His influence spread beyond Nigeria. Journalists from Europe, North America, and other parts of Africa traveled to Lagos to report on the musician who openly criticized the military government through song. Recordings reached new audiences overseas. Afrobeat was beginning to travel far beyond the city where it had taken shape. But international attention also brought greater pressure. The Nigerian authorities viewed Fela with increasing suspicion. To them, he was no longer just an entertainer. He had become a public figure capable of influencing thousands of people. His music challenged more than individual leaders. It questioned entire systems of power. One of his best-known songs, Zombie, used satire to criticize the behavior of soldiers who followed orders without question. The song became enormously popular among listeners. It also angered the military government. Its message spread through markets, buses, homes, and neighborhoods. People sang it long after the record stopped playing. The government understood something important. Songs could travel where speeches could not. By now, the distance between the stage and the state had almost disappeared. Every concert carried risk. Every new recording invited another response. Still, night after night, the music continued. The horn sounded. The drums rolled forward. The crowd answered. For many who stood inside the Africa shrine, it felt as though music had become a language for saying what could not safely be spoken elsewhere. Outside those walls, however, patience was wearing thin. The tension that had been building for years was approaching its breaking point. Soon, the conflict would leave the stage. It would arrive at Fela's front door. Chapter 4: The Day Abeokuta Burned. The signs had been there for years. Police raids. Searches. Arrests. Court appearances. The pressure never seemed to disappear for long. One confrontation ended, and another soon followed. Life at Abeokuta Republic continued. But everyone knew it existed under constant watch. Even so, the music did not stop. People still gathered at the Africa shrine. Musicians still rehearsed. Visitors still came through the gates of Abeokuta. New songs were written. New performances were planned. Life continued with the knowledge that it could change at any moment. Then, in February 1977, it did. Only days earlier, Zombie had continued to spread across Nigeria. Its sharp criticism of military obedience had reached audiences far beyond Lagos. The song had become one of Fela's most successful recordings. It had also become one of his most dangerous. On February 18, 1977, hundreds of soldiers surrounded Abeokuta Republic. Witnesses later described confusion and fear as security forces entered the compound. Residents were beaten. Buildings were damaged. Property was destroyed. Fires broke out. Years of work disappeared in a single day. Recording equipment was ruined. Musical instruments were smashed. Rooms that had once echoed with rehearsals filled with smoke and broken glass. The community that Fela had built was left in ruins. Many people inside the compound were injured. Among them was Fela's mother, Fela Anikulapo Kuti. She was already in her 70s. During the attack, she was thrown from an upstairs window, according to multiple eyewitness accounts. She suffered severe injuries. She never fully recovered. For Fela, the destruction of Abeokuta was more than the loss of a home. It was the destruction of a place that had become the center of his music, his work, and his community. The attack also reached beyond one family. Journalists reported on the violence. Human rights organizations raised concerns. Questions spread across Nigeria and beyond. How could a musician's home become the target of such force? The government denied responsibility for the raid. An official inquiry later concluded that the military could not be held responsible because the soldiers involved were described as unknown. That conclusion convinced few of Fela's supporters and has remained deeply controversial. The ruins of Abeokuta stood as their own testimony. Fela answered in the way he knew best. With music. In the months that followed, he released songs that reflected the violence he had witnessed. And the questions he believed remained unanswered. His recordings became even more direct in their criticism of those in power. But one loss could not be answered by a song. On April 13, 1978, Funmilayo Ransome Kuti died from complications related to the injuries she had suffered during the raid. She had spent much of her life organizing women, challenging injustice, and demanding accountability from those in authority. Now, the woman who had taught a generation to speak without fear was gone. Her death marked one of the deepest personal losses of Fela's life. Soon afterward, he carried her coffin to Doden Barracks, the headquarters of Nigeria's military government in Lagos. The act was both symbolic and deeply personal. It was a public accusation without the need for a speech. The image became one of the defining moments of his life. Many Nigerians saw it. Few forgot it. Yet grief did not bring peace. The years that followed remained difficult. Police continued to arrest him. His performances were disrupted. His recordings faced restrictions. Travel became complicated. Courtrooms became as familiar as concert halls. In 1978, Fela also made another decision that drew widespread attention. He married 27 women, many of whom had already been part of his household and performance community. The marriages became international news and added to the public fascination and controversy that already surrounded him. For some, the weddings became another reason to criticize him. For others, they distracted attention from the political struggle that had come to define his public life. Fela rarely separated his private life from his public image. Both remained subjects of intense debate. The conflict with the Nigerian state continued into the 1980s. Then, in 1984, he was arrested again. This time, he faced charges related to foreign currency offenses after preparing for an overseas tour. A military tribunal convicted him, and he was sentenced to imprisonment. Many outside Nigeria questioned the fairness of the trial. Organizations such as Amnesty International later identified him as a prisoner of conscience, arguing that his detention was politically motivated. Behind prison walls, the routines of performance disappeared. There were no stages. No cheering crowds. No late-night rehearsals. Only another test of endurance. Outside the prison gates, however, his music continued to travel. Records kept playing. Old songs found new listeners. His voice remained present even while he was absent. The government had destroyed his home. It had imprisoned the man. But it had not erased the music. And with every attempt to silence him, more people around the world began asking why his voice had become so threatening in the first place. When he finally walked free, Nigeria had changed. So had Fela. The years ahead would bring fewer illusions, more scars, and a reputation that had reached far beyond Africa. The struggle was no longer only Nigeria's story. It had become part of the world. Chapter 5: A Voice That Traveled. Prison changed the rhythm of life. For months, the days were measured not by rehearsals or performances, but by routines set by others. The stages were gone. The instruments were silent. The crowds that had once gathered deep into the night were now far away. Outside the prison walls, Nigeria continued to move forward. Governments changed. Policies changed. Military leaders came and went. But one thing remained the same. People still played Fela's records. In 1986, after about 20 months in prison, he was released. The military government that had jailed him was no longer in power. His conviction was overturned, and he walked free. Many wondered what would come next. Years of arrest, beatings, and imprisonment might have convinced another person to step away from public life. Fela did not. He returned to music. He returned to the stage. He returned to the conversations that had defined much of his life. The crowds returned too. Some had followed him for years. Others were too young to remember the beginning of his journey. They knew him through records passed from one friend to another, through stories told by parents, and through songs that refused to disappear. His concerts once again became places where music and public debate met. The rhythm was familiar. The questions were still there. As the years passed, Fela continued recording new music. Albums such as Beast of No Nation criticized dictatorship and the influence of powerful governments beyond Africa. The title itself challenged the language often used to describe African countries while asking listeners to think about who truly behaved without humanity. His criticism was no longer aimed only at Nigeria. He spoke about power wherever he believed it was being abused. International audiences listened more closely than ever before. Concert halls across Europe and North America welcomed Afrobeat. Musicians from different countries studied its long instrumental passages, powerful horn sections, and layered rhythms. Journalists described Fela as one of Africa's most original musical voices. For many listeners outside the continent, his performances became an introduction not only to Afrobeat, but also to conversations about African politics, colonial history, and cultural identity. The music crossed borders. Its questions crossed with it. Back home, Nigeria remained unsettled. The country experienced another military government. Economic hardship affected many families. Ordinary Nigerians continued to face rising prices, unemployment, and uncertainty about the future. These realities remained part of Fela's work. His songs continued to reflect the frustrations of people trying to build ordinary lives under extraordinary political conditions. He also entered politics directly. In 1979, he had announced the formation of the Movement of the People, a political organization through which he hoped to contest Nigeria's presidential election. The authorities refused to register the party. In later years, he continued speaking about political reform, even though former political office remained out of reach. Whether through elections or through music, his message remained consistent. He believed those in authority should answer to the people. By now, Fela himself had become part of Nigeria's public memory. Visitors from around the world came to Lagos hoping to see him perform. Researchers interviewed him. Filmmakers documented his work. Young musicians watched carefully, hoping to understand how he had created a sound unlike any other. Yet fame did not protect him from criticism. Some questioned his lifestyle. Others challenged his views. Even among those who admired his music, there were debates about his choices, his relationships, and the way he lived. Fela remained a deeply complex public figure. He inspired admiration. He attracted criticism. Often, he did both at the same time. As the 1990s began, another struggle quietly entered his life. His health began to decline. Public appearances became less frequent. Rumors spread through Lagos about the cause of his illness. But neither Fela nor those close to him spoke publicly about every detail. On August 3, 1997, his older brother, Dr. Abeokuta Kuti, announced that Fela had died the previous day. He was 58 years old. Dr. Abeokuta stated that the cause of death was complications related to AIDS. The announcement sparked conversations across Nigeria. At the time, HIV and AIDS carried deep social stigma. Many families avoided speaking openly about the disease. Public understanding remained limited, and fear often replaced compassion. Even in death, Fela's story forced difficult conversations into the open. News of his passing spread quickly. Radio stations interrupted their programming. Newspapers carried the story on their front pages. Across Lagos, people gathered to remember the musician whose voice had become part of the nation's modern history. His funeral drew an enormous crowd. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets to pay their respects. Some came because they loved his music. Some came because they admired his courage. Others came simply because they believed they were witnessing the end of an extraordinary chapter in Nigerian history. The man who had spent decades challenging authority was gone. But something unusual happened after his death. The music did not grow quieter. If anything, it reached even more people. Young artists continued discovering Afrobeat. Bands around the world borrowed its rhythms. Universities began studying his work. Documentary filmmakers returned to his story. Each generation seemed to ask the same question. How had one musician created a body of work that still sounded urgent years after it was first recorded? Perhaps the answer could not be found in the music alone. It was also found in the life behind it. The arrests. The performances. The losses. The refusal to stop asking difficult questions. His journey had come to an end. His influence had not. The voice that had once echoed through the Africa shrine was now traveling far beyond the streets where it first found its strength. And in the years after his death, the world would discover that Fela's greatest legacy was not simply a new sound. It was the courage to use that sound when silence might have been safer. Chapter 6: What Remains. Morning returns to Lagos much as it always has. The roads fill before sunrise. Street vendors prepare for another day. Buses weave through traffic. Music escapes from shop speakers, passing cars, and open windows. The city moves quickly, carrying old memories into new mornings. Somewhere in that sound, Fela is still present. Not because time has stood still, but because certain voices continue to travel long after they fall silent. Years have passed since his death in 1997. Nigeria has changed. Military rule gave way to civilian government in 1999. New generations have grown up in a country very different from the one Fela spent much of his life confronting. Technology has transformed the way music is recorded, shared, and heard. Young artists now reach audiences across the world with the touch of a screen. Yet many of the questions that filled Fela's songs have not disappeared. People still debate corruption. They still argue about leadership. They still ask how power should be used, and who should be held accountable when it is abused. The conversation continues. Only the voices have changed. For musicians across Africa and beyond, Afrobeat became more than a style of music. Its layered rhythms, powerful horn sections, and long instrumental passages inspired artists working in jazz, hip-hop, funk, rock, and contemporary African music. Elements of the sound Fela helped shape can now be heard far from the streets where it began. But influence cannot be measured by music alone. It can also be seen in courage. Many artists have followed his example by speaking openly about injustice, even when doing so carried personal risk. They have done it in different countries, under different governments, and in different musical styles. Not because they copied Fela, because they recognized the space he helped create. His family also continued part of that journey. His son, Femi Kuti, built an international career while developing his own musical voice. Another son, Son Kuti, later became the leader of Egypt 80, the band that had performed with his father during his final years. They did not replace him. They carried the music forward in their own way. Each year, people from many parts of the world gather in Lagos for the celebration. A festival created to celebrate his life, music, and ideas. Concerts fill the city. Young musicians perform beside established artists. Visitors who never saw Fela on stage experience his work through those who continue to play it. For many, it is more than a festival. It is an act of remembrance. The New Africa Shrine also stands as a reminder that places can hold memory. People come to listen, to dance, to learn. Some arrive knowing every lyric. Others are hearing the music for the first time. They leave carrying different memories, but they leave from the same place. History is often remembered through leaders, elections, and wars. Yet the story of Fela asks us to remember something else. A song. A crowded room. A band finding its rhythm. An audience discovering that music could ask difficult questions. His life was not without contradiction. He was admired by many. He was criticized by many. His choices continue to be debated by historians, musicians, activists, and those who knew him personally. Those debates are part of his history. Remembering someone honestly means allowing complexity to remain. It means resisting the temptation to turn a human being into a symbol without acknowledging the full weight of their life. Fela did not leave behind simple answers. He left behind questions. Questions about power. Questions about freedom. Questions about the responsibility of artists. Questions about whether culture can challenge authority. Each generation must answer those questions for itself. Perhaps that is why his story still feels unfinished. Not because history forgot to write the ending, but because the ending now belongs to those who continue listening. The young boy who once had hymns inside a family home in Abeokuta could not have known where his journey would lead. History rarely announces itself at the beginning. It begins with ordinary mornings, with families, with teachers, with songs. Only later do people realize they were standing at the edge of something that would outlive them. Fela's music outlived him. His questions outlived him. His influence outlived him. And somewhere today, another child is growing up surrounded by voices, listening carefully, learning quietly, unaware that history often begins exactly that way. Some stories end with applause. Others end with silence. This one ends with a question still echoing through the music. When power is afraid of a song, what does that song reveal? The answer has never belonged to one man. It belongs to every generation willing to listen. This is the African Archive. If this story matters to you, subscribe and join us as we uncover the next chapter of Africa's remarkable past. The archive is never closed. We'll see you in the next story.